We're going to be getting started with this webinar in just a moment. We already have a very large crowd, which is great to see. So I think I'm probably just going to get started here. Wow. Okay. So today.
Sorry, Harry. This is Francisco. I need to be assigned to the interpretation channel.
Okay.
I'm still in the main room.
Kristen, can you do that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so today we're really happy to have Marc Lipsitch to present to the MIDAS monthly webinar. I think most, or at least many folks in MIDAS will be very familiar with Marc's work. He's been associated with MIDAS for many years. Very briefly, he's currently serving now as the Director of Science in the CDC's new Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, on temporary loan, I guess, from Harvard. I'm not sure how you refer to it. I guess the language the CDC uses, seconded.
They're renting me.
They're renting him. But Marc's an internationally recognized expert in infectious disease transmission modeling. He's also been a part of the annual conference to increase diversity that we have every year. And clearly he is somebody who's attracted a lot of interest in the community because we now have over 100 attendees, which is about twice what we get for our usual webinars. So with that, I think I'm just going to leave it to Marc to tell us about the CFA and what they've been up to, and then hopefully we'll have some nice discussion after that. So thanks, Marc, for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Harry, and thanks to all of you for attending. I hope that some of the attendance is because people are interested in jobs, because that is one reason that I'm here. And I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. But it's really nice to be back. For those who don't know me, I lead the Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics at Harvard, which was a MIDAS Center of Excellence in the past, and have really grown up with MIDAS in a way in my career. And so it's really great to be back. And before I get into the more formal part of my presentation, I'll just say that sort of my experience in the last 2 decades or so in seeing the modeling and analytics of infectious disease trade grow in the United States has been that there has been a kind of an ecosystem centered around 3 institutions. One is MIDAS, a second is SysMid, the educational activity at the University of Washington, and the third is the RAPID group that used to exist through Homeland Security and NIH Fogarty. And my personal view, speaking just for myself, is that those 3 institutions have sort of created this field on a scale that had never really existed in the United States. And I think given the number of people at CFA on our founding team who have backgrounds in one or more of those parts of the ecosystem, I think it's fair to say that that the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, and the fact that it exists and is starting up when it is really a testament to the fact that the ecosystem has been prepared by MIDAS and by those other 2 entities. And I think the time was ripe. It's probably been ripe for a long time, but the time really is ripe, and that was why I decided to come on to lead a team along with Dylan George, who's also been very much a part of MIDAS and RAPID as well, that is setting this center up. I will confess that when I used to come to MIDAS meetings as a scientist, I found the presentations with org charts and lots of texty slides, kind of boring. And now I'm about to give one. So I will apologize for that and say that I'm going to try to keep it interesting, and that I will also try to keep it fairly short so that we have time to talk about the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics and what it may mean for various people, and what opportunities I think it brings. So with that prelude, I'll start the presentation, and the short history is that in January of 2021, President Biden's first full day in office, he issued National Security Memo Number 1, which called for the establishment of this center. It was funded in the American Rescue Plan that was passed by Congress soon thereafter, and we were brought on as a startup team, and I'll say who we is in a minute, in August. So we've been at it for about 3/4 of a year, and the startup team was myself and Dylan George as the two directors. Caitlin Rivers, who I think did her PhD in a MIDAS group and has stayed connected to MIDAS, from Johns Hopkins as the associate director, and Rebecca Kahn, who had been in my group as a senior scientist, and Allison Kelly as a CDC veteran, who is the deputy director. And so we have expanded a little bit beyond there, and I'll tell you what we're doing. But when we came together in August, I think one of the exciting things was that there was a very strong shared vision, which kind of got distilled into this tagline of better data, better analytics, and better response. So the vision that we have for the CFA is that there are decisions that need to be made at every level of government, and indeed by individuals, in the setting of outbreaks, and that better data and better analytics can feed those decisions and make them better decisions. And so we are really building this not as a basic science agency, but as a response-driven agency. And as I'll talk about in a few minutes, we've been, even as we're trying to build it, brought into the monkeypox response, the COVID response, a little bit into the hepatitis of unknown origin response. So we are already doing that. Some of the kinds of questions that modeling from CFA and our partners can inform or has informed are listed here. And all of you understand this because you do this kind of work. But some of the kinds of questions are how we think about scenarios of surges of new variants in COVID, what kinds of immune escape would lead to a surge, what is the testing demand likely to be, and what supplies are necessary, how would coverage of boosters change things, when should we time boosters for older populations to maximize protection, and then a number of emerging questions on monkeypox. CFA is designing ourselves to take on questions that arise throughout the time course of a pandemic or a pre-pandemic event. And we're learning what the sort of scope is a little bit as we get involved with monkeypox, which is on the order of sort of 1,000-ish cases in the world and 100-ish cases in the United States right now. And we've been involved since it was about a third that size, maybe. In COVID, we of course jumped in as soon as we had enough people to do so, which was around the time of Omicron, its emergence, so it was already global. And this diagram is really meant to make two points. The first point is that different analytical questions and modeling questions become important at different phases of an outbreak. So early on, We may have to do even qualitative scenario analyses, which is what we've been doing for monkeypox, because the data don't really support robust modeling of quantitative scenario analyses, but building qualitative ones is a starting point for refining the questions and understanding data needs to get better. As the epidemic progresses, we may get involved with risk assessment tools, mapping, parameter estimations. As we get countermeasures, we can start to look at effectiveness of those countermeasures and think about ways to do scenario analyses that answer questions about what may be coming in the months ahead. I think one of the interesting findings from the experience of the COVID pandemic is that many of these are recurrent. For example, parameter estimation in 2009, when I worked on pandemic flu, I thought of parameter estimation as a thing you do at the beginning and then you have those parameters, but we've seen that those parameters are changing as the population changes and as the virus changes. So that's a sort of recurrent question, not a single time question. But there is a sort of rhythm to which questions come up at which times. The second point that this slide is meant to make is sort of with the placement of the little green bricks here, which is to say that the focus of CFA is in the sort of to the right of the boom, as Dylan likes to put it. We are not really focusing right now on the determinants of spillover and the very early zoonotic issues. There's other parts of the government and other parts of the research establishment that are working on those questions, but we are really focused right now on the on the human-to-human part of outbreaks. And as I said, we're sort of learning those boundaries as particular events come up, because no two events are alike. But from the COVID perspective, if you think of January 2020 as kind of the point where we would have gotten involved, maybe late December, depending on how much had been known, but not before. And similarly with monkeypox and other things that we're beginning to get involved in. It's once the human-to-human transmission is really underway. And I should say, given that monkeypox human-to-human transmission was underway in Nigeria and elsewhere over a period long before it became a problem in the West, I think it's important to acknowledge that right now our efforts are focused at CFA on the United States, because that's where we are, and the government that's supporting us. We are also all well aware that that working on pandemics makes no sense in isolation, and that for all sorts of reasons it's important to be tied to colleagues and monitoring situations outside of our country. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. We've divided our efforts within the CFA into 3 divisions. That's the CDC term for something inside a center is called a division. So we have a predict division, an inform division, and an innovate division. The predict division is probably what you would imagine CFA would do, which is to generate analyses, maintain a data architecture, and respond to questions from decision makers. And that will be, so the predict division will be the sort of analytical engine of CFA. Thanks in part to the really strong leadership of Caitlin Rivers as one of our founding leaders, we are putting about 1/3 of our efforts into what we're calling inform. And the idea there is that modeling results and analytical results are useful in proportion to how well they're explained, how well they're presented, how clearly the uncertainties and the parts that are certain are presented, and there's a real science and art to doing that. So the production of high quality products to inform decision makers, including the public, about the situation in an outbreak is one of our important efforts. The Inform division is also meant to take in information, and so the idea there is that decision makers have sets of questions, and we need to understand what those questions are, and often work closely to refine those questions so that they're more amenable to modeling results. So as many of you will have experienced, a decision maker may come with a question that can't really be answered with a model, but where there's some related question that is also of interest that can be answered. And so it really is meant to be a two-way interaction. The third part of CFA is what we're calling the Innovate division, and that's really the research and development arm. And some of that is through familiar activities to MIDAS members, such as funding academic groups to push the science of modeling forward. I think we're at an early phase of the sophistication of modeling. It's much better than it was 20 years ago, and it has still a long way to go in terms of accuracy and timeliness. And so we want to and will support people to push the science forward while we're applying that science within CFA. And relatedly, we are using the Innovate division to interact with states and local. STLT is CDC jargon for state, territorial, local, and tribal entities. So the idea is to develop tools that may be useful at the state and local level, work with health departments at those levels to refine them, see how well they work, scale up the ones that work, fix the ones that don't work, or move on, and really try to build capacity at the state and local level, which I think in COVID we've really seen the value of. So this is the only org chart I'll show, and I think it is helpful a little bit to see how we're structuring ourselves really into these three divisions shown in different colors, and I'll focus a little bit on the predict piece, because I think there are a lot of ways that we might have chosen to organize ourselves, but the way we've done it is to split our efforts into what we're calling real-time monitoring, that is kind of routine production of repeated outputs in the course of a large event, and then analytics response branch, which is where we will respond to specific questions about how to do testing, or how to do quarantine, or how to do isolation, or how many doses of vaccine should go to different populations, and those kinds of things. So in the real-time monitoring, we've divided it into scenarios, forecasts, and natural history. Scenarios is consistent with the scenario hub that MIDAS has helped to lead, is the part that is trying to think in the 6-month or so time frame. Forecasts, consistent with the forecasting hub notion, is thinking in the sort of weeks to a month or two time frame, where the former is very much an if-then statement of what would happen if behaviors follow a certain pattern, if evolution of the virus follows a certain pattern, if vaccine uptake follows a certain pattern, and so forth. Whereas the short-term forecast is really meant to be, this is what we think will happen. And we've seen the challenges and opportunities of both of those in COVID. The natural history team is really what I called elsewhere parameters, trying to figure out how what are the key inputs into models. And then analytics response, there are sort of three illustrative teams. There will be more teams than this in analytic response, but the idea is that there will be groups that are expert in each of these kinds of topics, and other topics that are specific to a particular outbreak. And so this branch will reorganize itself to some extent as different events take our attention. I won't go through all the details of the other groups, but just to give you the sense that there's sort of the recurrent, we're doing this every week or every 2 weeks part, and the responsive part that's doing it as questions come up. So the activities of those teams would be things like trying to understand early in an outbreak, what's the epidemic potential and severity, what's the risk and timing of imported cases, and the risk to the US in particular, providing early warning, which you can read, and I won't go through the details of, getting critical data. So we are not big enough as CFA to generate on a large scale all the data that are needed for any single response, much less for each response. But we've learned in our experience so far, particularly with COVID, that it's really important for quantitative analysts and modelers to interact and identify which data are crucial to get, and then to find ways to get those data. So interacting with the other pieces of the agency to make sure that those data exist. And ultimately trying to inform policy and guidance on topics such as these that are listed here, some of which we've already begun to do in the COVID context and elsewhere, as I'll talk about in a minute. Actually, I'll talk about right now. So in those categories, in the early warning function, one of the first things we did was to provide early warning in November of 2021 of the likelihood of a surge of Omicron variant that had been seen in South Africa. From South Africa, it was possible to estimate parameters, as many groups did, but I think I found it a surprise a little bit coming into government, the importance of having a government voice that is saying that to other government agencies. I think many people thought this might happen. Many non-scientists probably didn't think it was going to happen. And it became really important to make a statement within government to make sort of sense of all the competing different voices that were giving different kinds of indications. So we did that within the CDC and up to the upper levels of HHS and the White House in November, and then publicly in December. One of the things that became clear as we were doing that was that while the number of cases was certainly going to be large, the severity of those cases was unclear. And there was early data from South Africa that was suggestive of a lower severity, but not exactly sure how much lower and how it would apply here. So one of our activities was to work with, was to identify a partner, which turned out to be Kaiser Southern California and Joe Lunard at the University of California, Berkeley, to provide early estimates of the severity of Omicron cases with US data. And part of our goal in doing that was to provide proof of concept that this could be done quickly. So between contacting Joe on December 3rd and the CDC director presenting the results on January 11th was about a 39 days or so to generate and analyze the data. And a lot of that was just, it took that long to get enough cases of Omicron to make estimates. So I think our goal is to provide examples and proof of concept to motivate more rapid and more comprehensive data acquisition. On a related topic, there are a number of CDC networks that gather vaccine effectiveness data, and so one of our analytical efforts has been to help them to design those analyses better. Making sense of uncertainty early in an outbreak is really, in a way, is sort of related to the providing early warning part, and trying to understand, as many groups were doing, but trying to synthesize evidence on the balance between immune evasion and transmissibility in Omicron. And then, as I said earlier, the goal of all of this is to support decision-making. So in that process, we had some input into the quarantine and isolation guidance, more input into the school test to stay guidance that was being introduced at that time. And I'm pleased to say that some of the analyses that we essentially helped to stimulate from the Northeastern group of Alex Vespignani and his colleagues, they were doing some of this work, but we helped to filter that work into the government decision-making processes, and informed the lifting of restrictions on travel from Southern Africa, not as soon as one would have liked, but sooner than in the absence of those data. So we've designed 4 principles to guide our decisions. I've sort of referred to some of these in a way already, but the first is mission impact and the goal of really informing decisions with everything we do. Second, to being open and transparent and publicizing as much as possible of the data analyses, code, and conclusions of what we do is a very strong principle that all of us hold. Collaboration is essential, especially in a global pandemic, and that means with state and local partners and with overseas partners and elsewhere. And finally, equity focus, which is a CDC priority, but is also a CFA priority. And we're actually bringing on someone next week, one of our early hires, to really focus on ways that modeling results and analytical results can enhance health equity by informing what are the sources of inequities and how they can be addressed. I think that's an area that a lot of people talk about, and the actual work in that area is fairly limited so far. So we have a lot of ideas about that, but would be very interested in hearing other ideas on ways that analytics can be harnessed for these purposes. I mentioned the importance of international collaborations. These are some of the groups that we have begun working with. It's very exciting that WHO has started a pandemic intelligence hub, which is really a CFA-like organization, but at the global level. The UK Health Security Agency has been restructuring for quite multiple rounds, but is a slightly different structural entity, sort of somewhere between CFA and CDC as a whole, with a very, very strong analytical team. And so we've been developing collaborations with them. Canada is setting up a similar effort, and we're working with some of the regional offices of CDC to try to expand efforts in that direction. The Data Modernization Initiative, or DMI, at CDC is another several-year-long effort that had been underway when we started, and is really in the progression from data to analytics to response. This is the group that's focused on the data and on trying to deal with problems that are endemic to health data in the United States, and not only in the United States, but especially in the United States, of disconnected information and difficulties in bringing information together. And so DMI is working with partners in the private sector, with software engineering and hardware engineering within CDC, and with other parts of the federal government and the state and local health departments to try to, in many different ways, improve the flow of data. And that, of course, is critical to our success. CFA does not yet have physical space, but when it does, it's going to be in Washington, D.C., not in Atlanta, where the main body of CDC is headquartered. The reason for that is to allow closer access to the other parts of the federal government. When it was chartered in the first national security memo, CFA was described as a national resource, not as just a CDC resource, and so that was the basis of the decision to be in DC. But it's become very clear that responses to health emergencies grow out of programs at CDC. There's sort of different levels of activation of responses as the scale of a problem grows. And so having partners within, close partnerships within the programs at CDC is going to be really essential to our success. So we will have some staff there, and some staff, and most staff in DC. I should say, I'll get to the recruitment pieces in a minute, but I should say that remote work and telework is an option for CFA personnel. To my surprise, the federal government has sort of leaned into remote and telework more than I would have maybe guessed, and we see it as a way to expand our talent pool in a way, in the setting of needing to get a lot of very talented technical people quickly. So some of this is more relevant than others to this group, but we are still at about a size of 12 people or so. We are planning to expand that by about 10 per month, and reach a steady state of around 130. To do that, we're using there's a federal data science job series, which allows recruiting of technical people. And we are one of the early adopters of that. We had a formal launch in April in DC, including an industry day and a White House event and a Capitol Hill day. And so that was our sort of formal launch about 6 months after our soft launch in last August. We've been working a lot to try to understand what modeling products are useful to more local levels of government, because we see that as such an important part of what we're going to do. And we've been meeting, as I said, with international colleagues. In fiscal 2021, which was before the leadership team of CFA started, people like Rachel Slayton and Matt Biggerstaff and Michael Johansson spearheaded efforts to start some of the what we're now calling Innovate activities, providing funds to a few universities to start work on relevant analytics. There's also we've also been establishing interagency agreements with the Department of Energy because of their national labs, and with the National Science Foundation. So one important thing to know is that through NSF, it's possible to apply for rapid grants, which are relatively small, but very rapidly and very short applications, rapidly evaluated. And CFA has put a pot of money at NSF to support that kind of work when it helps to amplify our response. And clearly, as we're small, but there are three different responses going on right now: COVID, hepatitis, and monkeypox. There are opportunities to do that. This is the last slide, I think. Yeah, this is the last slide, and it's borrowed from Jeff Shaman, who, as many of you know, is both a disease dynamics guru and a former, sometimes still, weather and climate scientist. And it just points out that it takes a long time to make forecasting and analytics useful. 50, 70 years ago, we were not very good at weather forecasting. We didn't have a very long time horizon, and we didn't have a very high accuracy. But with we being the community, not us, not me, but through investment in people, in computation, in better models, in better data acquisition, it was possible to make this weather forecasting better, and also to make it more useful. And I think those of us who are of a certain age remember the weather forecasts in the 1980s or 70s when they would tell you the relative humidity, and they would tell you the barometric pressure and whether it was rising or falling. And if you were a weather hobbyist, you knew what that meant, but it didn't tell you whether to bring an umbrella or not. And so I think the communication of weather forecasting has been another important part, and we take some inspiration from the idea that giving the information is not, in raw form, is not always the most useful, and that you need to make it digestible and understandable for people. So I'll stop there. I talked for longer than I anticipated, but still have hopefully left enough time so that we can have a good discussion. And maybe, sorry, one more thing I'll just say. We recently advertised positions in the predict division for the relatively more advanced pay grades of people, and those applications have closed. We will be and those are for people sort of at the postdoc and later level, or with postdoctoral experience and later. The next set of openings that we hope to have up shortly are at the master's to early postdoc or late or just post PhD level, and those are on USA Jobs. And so we will be looking for a range of different kinds of people. We may reopen the more advanced grades depending on what how many we hire from this pool. And then the Inform and Innovate divisions will be posting positions as well. So we certainly see MIDAS as one of the pipelines to creating the large number of highly qualified people that we need, and so we hope that people will apply, and I'm happy to talk about that more. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Mark. Very nice talk. Lots of interesting angles that involve a conversation about this. I know I've got questions that I will ask, but I expect others will come up pretty quickly. Please put something in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will share questions with Mark as they come in. We have first one here from James Koopman. There's little focus on evolution in the structure of CFA that you presented. This seems to be central for SARS-CoV-2 at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So there is in the COVID version of our analytic response teams, there is a variance and a variance team, and there's also a vaccine related team that has a piece of the evolutionary issue. I think that you're absolutely right. I think We're calling things by names that are more operational and less the sort of scientific basis and more what they relate to. But I think absolutely it's evolution is a important input and has had major impacts on forecasts and analytics. So I totally agree.
Okay, great. There are several things that came in here through the chat. I'm going to start with a quick comment from Sam Shiner of NSF, who wanted to clarify that the rapid funding is by invitation. So please contact NSF or CFA first. Thank you, Sam, for clarifying.
Thank you, Sam, for clarifying. Yep, I should have said that.
Okay. So just a couple of relatively, I'm trying to pick the order here. How long is the commitment to this center in terms of government money?
Great question. The initial pot of money is $200 million of what's known as, new term for me, no year money, which means that we, in principle, could spend it as fast or as slowly as we chose. The working plan is to spend that over about a two-year period, a little bit more, and that our operating budget is going to need to be, in the long run, on the order of $100 million a year. It's our goal to have that as a long-term support, but we have to accomplish that. And that's one of the things we're working on.
Okay, so another question here from an anonymous attendee. Will there be job openings for international scientists, non-citizens, to work with CFA?
Another great question. We have the GS, the government series jobs, are open to U.S. citizens and not to non-citizens, as I understand it. There have been a number of people who have contacted us who are not U.S. citizens, and my understanding is that there are ways that we can hire some number of non-U.S. citizens, and the way to do that, to express interest in that, is to write to cfa@cdc.gov. I'll put that in the chat, with a CV, and we can evaluate those as openings become available. I don't really honestly understand the process very well, but I know that we are attempting to do that with a number of folks.
I'm gonna guess there could probably be a whole other course on Dr. Lipsitch's crash course and how to transition from the academic world into the government world, but we'll save that for another time.
I think crash is the right word.
Okay, question from Don Burke. How will you approach the modeling of human behavior as a critical component of infectious disease dynamics?
Another good question. I think that in the short run, we are going to be making assumptions about it rather than explicitly modeling it, because it's so multidimensional that's what we know how to do in the short run. I think that's one, it's, if not the best example, it's certainly one of the best examples of an area that that a lot of work needs to be done in to improve the science of modeling. And so I would hope that my answer to that 5 years from now or 10 years from now would be a different answer and a more, a different answer. But I would say at this stage, clearly there are insights from behavioral models that can be incorporated into disease transmission models, but truly merging them, to me, is still a research area rather than an applied area. I suspect Don might actually disagree with that view, and if he does, I would love to hear the other side of it, because I think we would like to move the science forward as fast as possible, but no faster.
Okay, we have a ton of other questions here. Good, Mark Roberts. Good prediction is not always dependent upon mechanistic modeling, and understanding the impact of interventions might rely more on understanding the mechanisms than just prediction. How will the CFA support mechanistic investigations?
I'm not sure I understand what mechanistic investigations means. I can take a guess, or I can answer a different question, and then Mark can clarify what you mean by that.
Sure. Why don't we move on then? Pat Shea, to what degree we use formal decision theoretic methods in the CFA? Will you hire decision theoreticians?
That's another good question. I think it is not in our initial plans to hire a whole team of decision theoreticians. I think that might evolve quickly, because I agree with the premise of the question, that it's an important aspect. I would say that that there is a sort of separate stream of health economists at CDC that do a lot of related kinds of questions. Not all of it is formal decision theory. So I think with our current scale, it's not going to be as prominent as you would probably like, and as probably I would like also. But I agree with the premise of the question.
Okay. Another one here. What do you think the impact of the CFA will be on the academic modeling community? Are you going to displace some of the work that academic modelers do? And how should we, as academic modelers, consider adapting to that possibility in the event of future or continued outbreaks?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think we are already and will continue to support academic work. I think much of it on the more applied side, either on the more applied side when it's something that extends our capacity that we may not yet have, or the flip side of that is to develop the scientific underpinnings, so the methodologies and approaches, including things like incorporating behavioral science. So I think at those two extremes, those are things that we will support through the Innovate function. I don't think we can supplant academic modeling, or should. I think that the importance of having multiple voices remains, and independent voices and critical voices and all of that. But what I think is true is that there are certain questions that one very carefully worked out, professionally maintained model can answer better than a lot of quick SIR models, to just be very flippant about it. And so I think there are some functions that actually make more sense to do at scale, and we're going to try to be good at those things and not try to do everything for that reason. So I think there's still going to be lots and lots of work, obviously, to do in the academic world, and our goal is to enhance that rather than to supplant it. I think, as I said, there are some functions that are actually worth doing in a centralized way, but sort of I think the market will decide if that's true or not.
Okay, so we have some clarification from Mark here, which I think fits to what you were just saying, which essentially was saying that so many models, particularly ensemble models, are focused on fitting curves and not necessarily understanding underlying disease dynamics. So why do different models give different answers? And that would be important. I think that's what Mark meant by the mechanistic aspect of things.
Yeah. I think that is really important, and I think figuring out how to do that in the heat of battle is a really hard and important problem. What I mean by that is uh, uh, when you have multiple groups doing different models and coming to different conclusions, as we've learned from early MIDAS experiences, understanding those, even with 3 models, is like a big undertaking. It's not trivial at all. And with 15 models of different that are even more different from each other, uh, it's even harder, and particularly hard to do in real time. So uh, I think there's a need to support decisions with rapid answers, but there's also I totally agree that understanding why different models come to different conclusions, and really whether the differences matter, right? They might all come to different quantitative conclusions. They might all rank the different interventions in the same order. And I think understanding which differences are important for decisions, which gets to Kat's question as well, is an important part of it.
Okay, question from Cecile Viboud. Is CFA primarily focused on reacting to acute crises, or is there scope for working on long-term but perhaps less immediately acute problems such as AMR, early phases of pandemic emergency, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. I think that our focus, at least as we grow, is going to be on responding to emergencies. And, it seemed like COVID was a really big emergency, is a really big emergency, and that I think many of us imagined we would be dealing with the sort of sequelae of COVID for several more months, if not several more years, and now we have 2 other things consuming the time of the same dozen people. So I'm not sure we're going to get out of the cycle of responding to emergencies. I think it is really clear that, on the other hand, that investment in understanding, and I don't mean money necessarily, I mean money and time and scientific effort, investment in understanding things like global movement patterns and what kinds of forecasting approaches work for different kinds of diseases, and even STI models, which until a month ago we didn't think of as being all that relevant to acute pandemics. I mean, HIV pandemic for sure, but until recently, STI and pandemic didn't. Well, it's not a pandemic. STI and this sort of acute emergency didn't go together as much, and now with monkeypox, it does. So I think there is clearly value to investing in lots of things that are not respiratory pandemic diseases, and as our ratio of staff to number of concurrent emergencies increases, we do have a vision for doing that, but at the moment we're not there yet.
So a couple of questions here that I'm going to try to paraphrase a little bit. Really, I think have to do with the collaboration piece of this. And so folks have been asking, are you going to support helping researchers with data access? And will there be opportunities to set up long-term collaborations between the CFA and academic researchers?
Yeah, there are a lot of great questions in here, which I'm not going to get to in 3 minutes, but I will try to answer some of them. Can you send me these questions and I'll try to respond to them by email or something, because there's a lot of great questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Not all of them have names attached to them, but what we can do is if you want to, I can discuss with you how we can get answers back out
Yeah.
to the meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I can send, I meant email you and then you can share, not
Perfect.
necessarily, yeah. Um, so collaborations, we are still developing how the different ways that that's going to work. One is by funding groups, but through mechanisms that allow us to ask the groups to take on certain kinds of questions, and usually it's ask rather than tell, because that's how most of the mechanisms work. But so that's one way. One of my next jobs, probably in the fall actually, is to develop a plan to bring in rotators from academia, which is kind of what I am. I'm a 2-year rotator. I'm here through a year from now, although I'm taking two months in the summer and not doing this, but I'm here for another year as a kind of rotator on a well-established mechanism called an interagency personnel agreement, and that's a intergovernmental personnel agreement, IPA, and that's one mechanism, and we would really like to figure out a plan to do that more routinely with people from academia and the private sector, for a variety of reasons, but one of them being that when you're responding to emergencies, you are not developing the science. You can't do both at the same time well. And so in addition to developments outside that we will read in the journals and bring in, we also want to have the human beings that bring that innovation coming in and out of CFA. So there is no plan for that yet, but that is one of the items on the agenda to figure out.
Well, I think we're just about time here, and I'm going to take sort of the host prerogative to wrap things up. I want to really point out here that the job of setting something up like this up in the government in such a short time frame is no small feat, and the org charts may be a little bit dry and uninspiring at some level, but this is how the work gets done, and just to set that framework up, I'm sure has taken a lot of time and quick learning, as we said, crash course. So I think we really should be grateful to Marc and Dylan and the team for having put together this center in such a way. And we're really looking forward to talking more about what we can do to work with CFA as a community. And I think great things will be ahead. Just as a quick final note of early invitation, that there will be a panel about the CFA at the MIDAS meeting in September. So we're looking forward to hearing more. And so thank you, Marc, really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for attending. Look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and we'll have the recording up online soon.
Thank you all. It's great to chat.
Thanks again, Marc.
Bye.